Constantine,
Should I
I
hold
met
it?
Either way.
last October when I came to Moscow. I learned that he's a well-known TV personality. He's a filmmaker, and in fact, he was part of a film that on missile defense that he and a partner of his, Nikolai, produced. Nikolai came to the United States and just happened to come to Bath, Maine on the occasion of a protest at Bath Iron Works that we were doing at one of the christenings. He filmed part of that, and that became part of their film. But they also do a regular, I don't know if it's, would you call it a TV show or?
We used to be working on television. Now I canceled this job and switched completely to YouTube blogging. But up until recently, I was hosting a TV show called Agitprop, propaganda. So it was an irony in its name, sort of. So basically what we are doing now, we are mostly focused on producing short videos for YouTube and posting on other social media platforms. But prior to that, we were engaged in documentary filmmaking for quite a while, and yes, that's how we know you. In 2014, we produced a documentary called The Range of Destruction, which was devoted to the growing possibility of a major military conflict in Europe. And we also went to Latvia and many other places. In Germany, we filmed in Schwäbisch Gmünd, where in the 80s there was one of the U.S. Pershing II U.S. artillery brigades aimed at Moscow. So we talked to people there, and one of the main thoughts that we brought back and tried to share with our audience was that there's a widespread apathy and I would say people are ignorant and are not concerned at all about the growing chance of another catastrophe. We are roughly 70 years after the previous World War now, and the new generations are absolutely uneducated and are not interested, as we figured, in that potential danger, although they are going to be the ones to pay for all the expenses. And to my great dissatisfaction, here in Russia we are seeing almost the same picture. Young people are either consumed by the patriotic propaganda and are living in myths and in sort of self-propelled agitation that, you know, we are surrounded by enemies, and if anything happens, there's a popular saying here that if somebody in the West has forgotten the lessons of 1945, we can re-show and repeat it to it. I mean, it sounds crazy a bit, but this is not the majority. The majority of the young people just don't care, as young people in the US or in Europe don't care at all. And
well, let me just stop you there for a minute.
Oh, maybe I just
as part of your introduction, I'm still introducing you. You also have a rock band.
Oh, yeah. This is not the
I've shared some
major
of
thing
some
that
of your videos, but you do it, and you're the what we'd call the front man, the lead singer.
Yeah.
Is this a political? Are you trying to use that band to put these very political messages out there?
As a teenager, I was really impressed by what Rage Against the Machine was doing in the U.S. I spent about 5 years as a correspondent in New York and D.C. covering all the internal events in the United States, and I had a chance to meet Tom Morello at some of the street rallies in New York. So this is how I came to my belief that, you need to use all tools of propaganda that you have in your disposal, and music is one of them. And it is my great sorrow. I mean, I'm not alone. I'm not the only one who misses bands like Rage Against the Machine a lot, because things in the world, around the world, are going into a very dangerous direction, and there is just nobody on the global pop, rock, rap scene who would reflect that, who would share a word of anger or frustration about the whole course of what's happening. So that's how we started our own, I wouldn't call it a rock band, it's more like a satirical performance. And we try to blend irony with politics. We try not to be as serious as everybody else, although the events themselves, the local political agenda and the global agenda are definitely are not funny in any dimension, but we try to make fun of it so that people are not too
Well,
disappointed.
welcome.
Yeah.
Welcome, and please
Thanks.
welcome our friend Constantine.
Thank you so much. I already started, so I maybe need to add a few words about myself. I was born in the Urals, 2,000 kilometers away from here. It's the capital of the industry, one of the most complex and sophisticated industrial regions of the former USSR. My relatives worked at one of the military factories, and I graduated from local university, faculty of journalism, and then studied in the US for a little while, as I already said. I spent 20 years working as a television reporter for one of the major Russian TV stations, Russian state television. I worked in New York as a US-based correspondent. I also covered shortly some events in the Kremlin. From day one in this profession, I was interested in the economical aspects of everything I was sent to cover, and that's how when I grew up, I ended up being I wouldn't spend much time describing it. I put it straight, and ending up being a socialist, because when I covered the war in Yugoslavia, in former Yugoslavia, or the conflict in Chechnya, or when I traveled to Pakistan in 2001, right before the US bombing of Afghanistan, or when I covered in 2003 when I was embedded with the USS Harry Truman in the Mediterranean, or when I was covering New Orleans and the flood of 2005, the Katrina disaster. All that somehow combined in my mind made me to see the universal connections between all the events that seem to be isolated for our audience, and the growing, the unfolding crisis of the capitalist system at some point seemed to be undeniable to me. In 2008, when the major banks collapsed and all the countries, including Russia, felt the influence of the crisis, I think it was the right time for everybody to get alarmed and to start thinking about where the world is headed to. Unfortunately, although we can see the rise of popularity of the socialist ideologies in Europe and Russia and in the United States, we are still very marginal in numbers, and the media are still dominated by the bourgeois ideologies. We are constantly hearing that capitalism will survive another crisis, that it is a perfect system which in its genes has the possibility to overcome all the internal problems. But because I was born in the Soviet Union, the country that paid one of the highest prices in World War II, and every family here, including my own, has the traces of that war in its history, I think that it's our obligation, it's our that's what we have to do. We have to educate people on the danger of war, and we have to do everything we can to avoid another potential disaster, potential catastrophe. The numbers, the nuclear capacities, the arsenals built by the major superpowers now are, you all know this, are more than enough to evaporate every human being on the planet. And I think there's nothing unexpected in this, nothing totally unique. Humanity had already seen this in the past. Both world wars of the 20th century were preceded by the same level of ignorance and inability to see, actually, to see the contradictions of the capitalist system, which capitalism is unable to solve. This is maybe something very theoretical and far away from what you are supposed to hear from me. But
you're supposed to hear whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah. But I would prefer to answer questions if you have any. That would be much easier because I don't have a structured speech and the number of theses to spread around. A few words about the aspects of what's happening in Russia after 2014, after the conflict with Ukraine started, that worry me a lot. Russia is a capitalist country. This is not a secret to all of you. Since 1991, we are seeing the very same development of capitalism as many other countries in the world already went through. Like Germany in the 1930s, Russia saw unspeakable destruction of its production forces and production means in the 90s. The level of, I think we're still at 25% of the population who lives below the poverty line.
What was it again?
25%. And unlike in the early 90s, when the Russian capital was very weak and immature, today we are seeing it growing and expanding. And to an outside observer, it starts to look as any other capital in the world looked in history. The smaller businesses are merged into bigger monopolies. These monopolies are becoming huge capitalist enterprises with its own interest here and abroad. They are exploiting the local labor viciously. That's how we are having these poverty rates. That's why. And at the same time, as any other capital, it is thinking about expansion and colonizing, using any opportunity to multiply its assets, whether it is in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in Hungary, or in the United States, where the Russian oligarchs do own companies now, do own industries. So what I want to say is that Russian capitalism is no different from any other capitalism in the world. So the internal laws, the principles for its development are absolutely identical to what you can find in any other corner of the world. And according to these laws, at some point it should become aggressive, and it becomes aggressive. Aggressive to its own population, to its own labor. That's why we're seeing our own austerity measures being implemented, our own pension system cut, and our levels of exploitation high rocketing. And aggressive on the outside. I'm not blaming Russia for what is going on and for the catastrophe in Donbass or for the secession of the Crimea. But there's a certain amount of guilt on the Russian oligarchy as well. In 2009, with my colleague and older friend, the Oscar-winning filmmaker Vladimir Menshov, we produced another documentary on Ukraine. It is called Ukraine. I traveled throughout the whole country from Lvov to Donetsk or Simferopol. And it turned out that the country became it became an arena of competition between the Western capital, German capital, Polish capital, Ukrainian native capital, and Russian capital. And where the nationalist, where the ultra-radical sentiment grew from, was that contradiction. Every neo-Nazi or nationalist group in the world, be it in California or in Germany or in Ukraine or in Russia, is a tool in the hands of capitalists. So I spoke with the early Ukrainian neo-Nazis who were not as popular as they are today. Like I talked to Andrei Biletsky, who is heading one of the big political parties in the Ukrainian parliament now. Back then he was just a young kid running the Ukrainian Patriots movement. And I knew that it wasn't a secret that these young nationalist groups were controlled by the local security services, who were in turn working for the Ukrainian oligarchs. The reason why they needed nationalists was very simple. They had to find means to protect their assets, the privatized former Soviet assets, from the expansion of the aggressive Russian capital. Russians wanted to take part in the Ukrainian privatization, to place their hands on the big factories going through privatization, etc., etc. So nationalists were needed. This was the way for the Ukrainian oligarchs to protect themselves. I'm not saying that they are in any way better than the Russians who wanted to get in. On the other hand, the Ukrainians were buying assets and buying factories and getting into the capitalist alliances with the local companies here. So it was mixed. But this is where nationalism was extremely needed. And that's how all the neo-Nazi movements spreaded and flourished in Ukraine. So to me, what happened on Maidan in November 2013 and later was the logical conclusion of that struggle, not between the peoples of Ukraine and Russia, not between the cultures, not between the languages, but between the two bands of oligarchs. And of course, there were outside players like the US and the State Department and the CIA and the Germans and the Poles and everybody else who just jumped in to take part and to get their piece of that dismantling country. In the spring of 2014, when the so-called revolution on Maidan was already over, the eastern regions of Ukraine, Donetsk, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye, and others revolted. And we witnessed it, and we covered it as well. And at the very early stage of this popular uprising, it was a true, I would say, people's revolution, not different from what happened on Maidan. Absolutely the same. People were really fed up with corruption, with poverty, with inequality, with injustice, and they revolted. And most of them they were motivated by socialist beliefs and ideologies. There were red banners. The International was sang on the streets, etc., etc. When the conflict expanded, and Russia as a country, as a capitalist country, had to get involved, it quickly turned out that neither the Ukrainian authorities nor Russian authorities are interested in letting this popular revolution succeed. So it was slowly strangled by both sides. The popular leaders of both uprising on Maidan and in Donbass were either isolated or simply murdered. So what we're seeing now is a conflict between two oligarchic systems. One Ukrainian directly run and manipulated by the West. It is not independent, obviously. The other one is not really different from the first one. The Russian so-called protection of the people in Donbass is not motivated by the real interests of these people. This is a typical capitalist confrontation, typical capitalist conflict that the history of the 20th century can give us many examples of. And that worries me even more, because when we were talking about the Russian-NATO confrontation in 2014, in the not knowing where the war in Ukraine is headed to, it was a little different. Now, if Ukraine is going to obtain middle-range nuclear missiles, which it declares it is willing to, it may become a real powder keg of Europe. And if anything happens in the Black Sea, in the Baltics, and we know that there are daily NATO sea patrols in these areas, it will quickly evolve into something much bigger than just just Russian Ukrainian, just a Russian Ukrainian regional war. And unfortunately, you all know this. I'm trying to analyze it as a journalist, not as a Russian citizen. The very same situation is gradually unfolding in the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea. And not only there, the Hormuz Strait and Iran, Venezuela and Colombia and Brazil. The world is becoming really dangerous place to. What?
I just have a question whenever.
Yeah. I'm finishing.
Okay.
That's the number. This is obvious to anyone who watches television or just keeps himself updated on the news. The other thing that is very worrisome is that along with this growing threat of war, there's a growing threat of right-wing of the whole political system of Russia, United States, as I said, Brazil, Germany, take any other country, drifting to the right. So we are not seeing a 1937, 1939 situation where there could be possibly a peaceful bloc of nations willing to preserve peace. It will look more like a pre-1914 situation when there are competing, aggressive, capitalist, imperialist governments willing to do everything they can to protect, to defend their national dignity, as they claim, but in reality to secure their oligarchic, their capitalist profits. That's the only thing they are concerned of. That's the only thing they are fighting for, whether in Colombia, or Venezuela, in China, in Egypt, in Russia, in Ukraine, elsewhere. The problem is that the world is absolutely ignorant about it, that there are just a few of us who understand it. And what's missing, if we compare that situation to the First World War and the period before it, what's missing is the international movement of the working class, of the only class which is capable to do something about it. And if something bad begins, if something bad happens and it starts, there's a missing link. There's no second or third or fourth international to step in and to say no to this. And that worries me even more than everything what I described before. That's why, as a tiny band of socialists here, we are trying to build links with our fellow, with our friends and with people across all borders. That's why we go to Spain and look for like-minded activists there. That's why we are trying to reach across the ocean to the United States, to any other country, until it's not too late. That's the main purpose why we invited Bill to be a part of our show. We haven't yet translated, published the English version, but I hope we'll do it someday, eventually. This is what motivates us, and that's why I'm here. So this is why I would like to...
Just repeat that thing you said earlier about the apathy that concerns you about the new generation.
Yeah, it is a very saddening fact that young people in Russia and in other countries, including Ukraine, Poland, Germany, Spain, the United States, or Great Britain, are very uneducated and are very unalarmed about the direction of the global politics, and the danger of war and potentially military war is not obvious to them. I think that we need to rebuild this international solidarity movement. When we filmed this episode about the Schwäbisch Gmünd artillery brigade, with the Pershing II brigade in Germany, we went there and we visited one of the local museums built around Cold War, etc. And we saw many photographs from the 1980s. We saw the former German Ministry of International Affairs, Joschka Fischer, as a young man, as a student, lying on the road leading, which led to the US base, protesting there as a part of a green movement, I don't remember. We didn't meet a single person during that trip. It was a very populous movement in the 80s. People were really protesting. There were mass demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations in the Soviet Union. Nothing of that kind is happening now. Here, there, anywhere. And that is more dangerous even than the war itself, in my opinion. There was a very popular perception among the masses here that Putin is running the oligarchs, that oligarchs are controlled, and he, as a former Soviet security officer, is motivated by some higher ideals, and oligarchs would have to do what he's telling them. But the grim reality is, and this is my guess, I cannot confirm it with solid knowledge or evidence, but the reality is that Russian capitalism is no different from any other capitalist society in the history of humanity. It is not run by a single person, and that's what Marxism is teaching us. It is run by a class, and here or there in Turkey, the system is not run by Erdogan. It is run by the major oligarchic families, by the major industries, by the major companies, the private profiteering names who are behind any popular politician. So here we're seeing almost the same picture. It is not Putin who controls the show. It is the Russian Forbes list. And if we make one step further, we may guess that from, talking about the restoration of national dignity or pride, any capitalism, and Russian capitalism is not an exception, would very quickly go to that stage of expansion, of colonizing and eventually war. So that worries me a lot because as a Soviet kid, as a Soviet child, as somebody who grew up in the Soviet Union, I don't want my country to turn into the remnants of other countries in history which took part in wars or instigated wars. Thank you. I think that we need to learn more, know more about all these movements and events, and that's what we're trying to do. That's why we are looking for anybody in Germany or in the UK who could be willing to talk to us, maybe invite us to take part in the rallies, in the marches, in the protests. At the same time, I think that the anti-war movement in itself is not enough. It's not sufficient. It is a class war. And the class war, as you all know, is the only mean to fight the real war. So class war is fought by classes. Without mobilizing a class, an oppressed class, an exploited class, we cannot think about winning this war. So we definitely need not only bright-minded individuals, young individuals in other countries. We need political movements for the working class willing to take part in this struggle. And there's a problem with it, here and there.
Absolutely. I think that some of these protests are ways in which people can learn, young people can learn about these.
But you're right, it is changing, and we're closely watching the course of events in the United States with its growing interest to the social democratic or pure communist ideologies. I don't know what are the exact organizations or people we need to contact, but we're watching closely. Last week there was a huge union strike, teachers strike in Poland. Very interesting. And you know, it is Poland and Russia is a very hotly debated issue. Russian audience, Russian public is easily manipulated into hatred, into animosity towards the Poles. Same there, same thing happening there, and boom, we are seeing a really tremendous outburst of public anger and union activity in Poland. Something very remarkable we need to think of, and we are definitely looking forward to communicating with our Polish friends. I won't argue. A friend of mine, one of the Marxist thinkers from Ukraine, a lady who lives now in Moscow and writes extensively on that matter, she said once that we are entering an era of competing smaller and bigger fascisms, which may sound as an exaggeration, but may be not too far from reality. I mean, I went to Turkey in 2016, and before the coup, the unsuccessful coup there, I couldn't find too many differences between Turkey and us, Turkey and the United States. They are doing the same things with their working opposition, with the left parties. They're all called traitors, agents of the outside forces. Any independent voice is suppressed. Anybody could be easily sent to prison just for, you know, raising a voice of disobedience or disagreement. And corporations are running the show, not just, and that they're exploiting the nationalist or Islamist fervor in order to build mass support and solidify this unity of capital and state. So it's just one of the examples. Any other country could be next. I don't think they're guided. They have their own interests, and it is
Inferior countries.
Yes.
Just you have visited Pakistan.
Absolutely.
So
And Pakistan is moving closer to China, and India is collaborating with the United States, and Russia is trying to play all cards.
big brothers.
Same thing. And if you take a look at India with its ruling nationalist party and the big businesses behind it, it's no different. And the Chinese policy towards this region and Pakistan and India and Nepal, I don't think that it is dictated by any different motive. It is all the same. So this is just another example of the very same picture that I already drew. It is absolutely the same, and nobody knows where the explosion will happen, but the chance, the possibility of another explosion is growing day by day, and the mechanics, the physical structure of the whole system is the same. It's no different. So it really doesn't matter if we are talking about Taiwan and China, versus India and Pakistan versus India, Iran versus Saudi Arabia and Yemen. What else? Again, Latin America or Russia or Ukraine or capitalism. What I learned as an aspiring Marxist is the system built on contradictions. That's the main thing, right? The main contradiction of capitalism is, if I'm not mistaken, is the contradiction between the public mode of production and the private method of profiteering. So this is a built-in contradiction which capitalism will never be able to overcome. Doesn't matter if it's China or Russia. It's all the same. Our big bankers and big oligarchs are growing stronger, and they want more, and theirs are the same, and they won't be able. Like if we imagine a planet populated, where all capitals, all governments are populated by Trumps, and every country is making itself great again. There's no solution to this equation, right? And this is exactly what's going on. We have a smaller Trump in Turkey, quite significant Trump here. We have a Trump in the U.S., a Trumpish communism in China, and in India, Modi, it's an Indian Trump. Bolsonaro in Brazil, isn't he a Trump? So Trump is everywhere, and we're trumped in a way.
That's good, yeah.
Well, my band's name is Gianni Rodari. Gianni Rodari was a popular writer and an Italian communist. He wrote mostly for children in Italy and here. He was a very popular figure in the Soviet Union. He was also very satirical, so he presented the ugly, gloomy reality of capitalism in a very funny and easily digestible way. So I think that one of the most effective weapons of propaganda, anti-war, anti-capitalist propaganda now, is irony, is satire. We cannot fight them seriously because we are unarmed. We are isolated from all means of propaganda, from all tools of propaganda. I won't be heard. I'm not going to be on television. I'm not going to be popular on the internet because I will be just erased from the Google search line, right? As it is happening in the United States. I won't be seen on the social media. What I can do in this situation, I can look for people like myself and I can start laughing. When you cannot do much, you can at least laugh at the circumstances and the authorities that you cannot change and you cannot really struggle against. I'm still a big fan of the revolutionary poetry and music of the bands like Rage Against the Machine. I'm seeing a number of followers of other bands who are trying to follow up. Of course, none of them is equally strong and expressive and powerful. As for Pussy Riot, honestly, I don't feel they. First of all, they are not musicians. They just don't know music. There's nothing musical and attractive in what they had been doing. I'm not sure if they're performing today. Secondly, they are not concerned about the things that I'm talking here about now. They are just looking for hype. they are trying to gain popularity on confronting religious minorities or majorities it has nothing to do with the real system. They are not talking about capitalism, for example, because they are not anti-capitalist. They might be anti-Putin, but that's not enough. So I don't think they are the way to go. Not too many other examples that I might mention here.
I know it's not your area of expertise, but I just
Yes,
wondered
it is not. I recently interviewed 2 Russian professors in political economy who are also following the Marxist tradition in their work. And both of them told me that the current explosion of mass anger and protest, which at times might look like civil wars in the Middle East or in Latin America, in the drug war in Mexico, for example, we can see it as a drug war. We can see the civil war in Syria, or the rise of, I'm afraid to say it, the rise of extremist movements like ISIS in the Middle East. But all that to a scientist might look like an explosion of class anger, maybe unconscious explosion when the class itself does not realize it in such an ugly and barbaric and medieval form. But still, if we take a look at numbers, there are more than 4 billion of workers in the world today, of all sorts of labor, be it peasants or industrial workers. Never in the history of humanity we had such a high percentage of workers. So there definitely is the growing contradiction between this side of the political spectrum and the other one. It might explode into religious conflicts. It might look like a drug war in Rio de Janeiro, where drug cartels are miraculously, unexpectedly becoming communes and guarding their population from the oppression of the outside forces. Which, I mean, it's weird, it's ugly, but this is the world we are living in. So I don't think that we should put any hope on Islam, on Orthodox Christianity, or any other religion, or any other cult or movement. But the contradictions are brewing underneath, and they will come up to the surface in one way or another. And all forms, all sorts of collectivism, I think, will be participating in this, regardless of where it is happening. This is my guess. I might be wrong. I think that these issues are inseparable, and they go hand in hand. Like now, there's a growing protest movement in Russia caused by the privatization of the how's that industry called, of the garbage recycling industry. The new sites for the storage of waste are built all across Russia, and particularly in the north. People are starting to protest once they understand that this is not an irrelevant thing for them, far away from them. It is right here in their backyard, and it has direct impact on their families and their children. So I mean, 5 or 10 years ago, the whole environmental agenda was absolutely unimportant for a regular Russian. The situation changes because we're producing so much waste and so much plastics and so much garbage that you can see it even here if you take a ride on the Moscow Beltway. You'll see giant piles, big recycle centers right next to the border of the city. This is how much waste we produce. We are no different from any other capital, big city in the world. But if you connect all the dots and if you see it as, from a distance, you would obviously understand that this mode of production is destroying not only a village, a neighborhood, or somebody's family, it is destroying the whole planet. It is incapable of utilizing the amount of waste, the amount of greenhouse gas it produces, etc., because it is uncontrolled completely. It is controlled only by one interest of profiteering. So I think these are two inseparable things, and we should understand that we cannot achieve a single objective in this fight for cleaner, unpolluted air, for the preservation of nature and climate, etc. We cannot achieve this goal without addressing the core issue that causes it. And the core issue is, yes. It's a tough question. I think there's no smaller evil here. There's no progressive side. Though it's very sad. It would be easier for me as a Russian, and I used to believe in that in the past. I was seeing my country as a remnants as an ancestor, as a successor to the USSR. It is not, unfortunately. It was.
But it is taking a rather progressive stand in the United Nations. The only Security Council member who is very vocal about the UN Charter against the rule of law and things like that.
Correct, but it is what is being done at the Security Council is not motivated by any progressive agenda or interest. It is the way they are trying to protect themselves from the NATO expansion, from being dragged into another conflict, because we are a small capitalist country. We are just 2% of the global GDP. We are not like China here. And on the other hand, I would correct you, dare to correct you. I don't think that the number one conflict is between Russia and the US now. It is the Chinese-American confrontation which dominates the whole international politics, and Russia is just calculating which side it has to associate itself with. This is what Trump brought to the White House. Regardless of what they are writing in Washington Post, this is what's happening. China versus the United States. This is what will define the future of the capitalist world tomorrow. But as far as the progressive steps taken in the Security Council, I think we have to take them dialectically. We have to support everything that is aimed at preventing another war. And if there's a war on the horizon in Venezuela and China and Russia are doing something to avoid it or to freeze the things a little bit, that should be seen as a positive tendency. On the other hand, we should all understand and get rid of all illusions that they are doing it for any potential good. They are motivated mostly by their commercial interest, because Russia and China heavily invested in. Although we are actually talking maybe 100 meters away from the Chavez Street here, it doesn't mean anything. It does not mean anything. Russia is acting like any other capitalist government or capitalist country before and will be acting after. So again, there's no minor evil or major evil. it is all the same. And if at any moment the Russian oligarchs, the ultra-rich, the super corporations feel that they are no longer limited in their actions by the pressure from the US or any other actor, they would act the very same way. They would be no different. And in my opinion, what's happening now between Russia and Belarus is the visual representation of that idea. Nothing surprising or unique. One good news that I forgot to share with you is that there's a growing number of, although small, Marxist circles or clubs growing all across Russia, and they are inhabited with very young people. So the questions that you raised are fiercely discussed here between ourselves. Because here we have the very same situation. We have millions of workers migrating to Russia from the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, for example. And here they're enjoying much higher standards of living, although they're obviously exploited, and the very same as Mexicans are in the US. So I think in Capital, Marx, and in Imperialism as another stage, another form of capitalism, Lenin, they both wrote about the workers' aristocracy, about the people in developed capitalist or imperialist countries who are, although they are still proletarians and they are still selling their labor, they are enjoying benefits from the ruling class because their countries are using that labor in the broader exploitation in their colonies. So this is nothing unique. It had been happening in the United Kingdom in the 19th century, elsewhere. And we shouldn't, I don't think that we should not expect this class to see itself as a class and to begin moving as a class until the internal contradictions force these people to wake up. And what brings such contradictions, unfortunately, is the global competition, is the contradictions between the capitalist countries. I don't want to sound apocalyptical here, but the stepmother of the Russian Revolution, as Lenin once said, was the First World War. Without it, the vast masses of Russian workers wouldn't have been mobilized and wouldn't have risen up against the oppression. So as far as the middle class and the financial industries and the involvement of workers in the IT sector, here in those clubs and circles that I mentioned, we tend to think that there's nothing wrong with the working class. It didn't disappear. It is still here. You don't have to be a worker of manual labor. You don't need to be working at a factory. The only thing you need to do is to be selling your ability to work, your working time, your labor. And any programmer or any banker or any designer whom we call middle class now. In fact, they are still workers. They are not owning their means of production. They are selling their potential labor or actual labor. So I don't think it's different. It's the difference is that they don't see themselves as workers.
They are wage slaves, but they love their slavery.
Yes, until the contradictions start to break it from within.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
What about the labor movement here in Russia? And how does that compare with our very weak labor movement in the U.S.?
Same.
5%?
We see your weak labor movement as an example of the working class struggle, because like we throughout this last year we are following your teachers strikes, your unions or automobile unions strikes. We know that they are not entirely independent, that they are controlled, that they easily get into alliances with the companies, with the government, into cooperation with them. We all know that, but even that for Russia is something huge and unimaginable, because all Russian, in the Soviet Union, we used to have a very powerful and big union system.
Yes.
It was all dismantled, and what's remained of that is under total, complete control by the employers or by the government.
Oh dear.
So we might have 2 or 3 independent unions here, and they're very small, very ineffective. We're trying to support them, to help them with our own propaganda and help people to start new. According to the Russian laws, you need to have just 2 counterparts, 2 companions to establish a union. Yeah, but in practice, it turns out to be almost impossible, especially if you are living away from big cities and your employer is your government, local government. If you try to do something like that, you can get fired, imprisoned, or even killed. That bad. So the union struggle is in a very poor shape here, unfortunately. But people are slowly, gradually, with all these austerity measures implemented by the government, they are slowly waking up, not to the union fight, not to the class struggle, but to the theory we are talking about here now. So we are beginning the process of education, and we are seeing workers and teachers and government workers being more and more enthralled, interested in such matters. I think we are in the very early stages of that process. I think it would be correct to compare the development of the Russian capitalism to the late 19th century in the US, although we're very weak and we don't have our own Morgans and Rockefellers, so effective Morgans and so effective Rockefellers, but the working class movement is very tiny, and it's just the beginning.
All right, well, please thank Constantine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate your comments.